I'm a student navigator at Kennebec Valley Community College. And on behalf of the Summit Planning Team, we are thrilled you've joined us today. This summit started 4 years ago with the goal of bringing together higher ed professionals throughout Maine to discuss our common concerns and share our creative solutions for better supporting the success of our veteran and active duty students. And this goal remains the same today. And basically, as I've confessed to many of you already, we wanted to bring together people with more knowledge and talent than I have and find out what they were doing well so we could steal it. This spirit of shameless collaboration is the only reason we're here today, because after canceling last year's summit, which was fatefully scheduled for the end of March 2020, I wasn't sure that we'd keep our momentum. It is only due to the energy and persistence of my colleagues on the planning team that we've been able to keep this summit alive, and it has been an honor to ride their coattails this year, and I'd like to recognize them now. They are Lori Spalding, Director of Veterans Services for the University of Southern Maine, Allison Nolan, Graduate Assistant for the Office of Veterans Services at USM and student in their School of Social Work, and Camden Edge, Director of the Maine State Approving Agency for Veterans Education Benefits. It has been a privilege to work with you and to watch this summit grow. This team has thoughtfully pieced together 3 days of programming devoted to supporting the work you all do day in and day out, attracting and retaining student veterans. We're very excited for the rich discussions that will take place in the days to come. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we move on. First, sessions this week will be recorded for the purpose of proving to my future grandchildren that I was once part of something useful, and also with the hope of preserving this work and sharing it down the road with those who are unable to attend. Stay tuned for more information to come about how to access these videos because we're still figuring that out. Second, you may be interested in attending a session for which you did not register, and that is not only acceptable, but highly encouraged. At the end of each presentation, we'll share a link to the next session in the chat window for your convenience. Please attend every workshop that you can. And finally, although we know we've organized this summit perfectly and no feedback is necessary, we know it's customary to provide an evaluation to participants of these types of things, so we will reluctantly do so. Again, near the end of each session, you will find a link to this survey in the chat window, and we'll email you once more with these links following the end of the summit. If nothing else, your feedback can ensure that I never serve as MC again. So sharpen those pencils. Just kidding, it's an electronic survey. All right, thank you so much for your attention. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first guest of honor, Kennebec Valley Community College President, Dr. Richard Hopper, to offer welcoming remarks. President Hopper.
Thanks, Brian. This is great. I see we have 40 participants, and I want to thank everybody for joining us and participating in this today. And I want to thank you for inviting me to provide a welcome to this group of veterans. First, I want to thank all veterans that are here today and across the country for their service, commitment, sacrifice, and care for the United States, its people, its government, and our standing in the world. Thank you. It's very exciting to have Jared Lyon here, President and CEO of Student Veterans of America, as your keynote. Thank you for joining us and supporting this endeavor. We're very grateful to have you, and I'm sure folks will learn a lot from you. It's important to note, some people don't realize that Maine ranks third for the percentage of veterans in our population after Alaska and Montana. We have a large percentage of veterans in Maine, so you're in very good company. Nearly 9% of our population has served, and that means that when you walk in the streets, you're likely to bump into nearly 1 out of every 10 people you meet will be a military veteran in the state of Maine. This is a real source of pride for me, and it's a real source of pride for the college. KVCC provides benefits to approximately 135 veterans who are degree-seeking students. Again, this is about 1 in 10 of our degree-seeking population. So the KVCC population reflects very much the population of Maine when it comes to veterans. And I think this should make veterans at KVCC feel quite welcome and understood, hopefully. On November 1, 2017, we opened and dedicated a veteran space called the Veterans Lounge in the Alphon Recreation Center here on the Alphon campus in Fairfield. We hosted a ribbon cutting ceremony at which time we raised a flag that had flown over the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. This was made possible thanks to former Congressman Bruce Poliquin, and it now sits on display in the Veterans Lounge. And when we all get vaccinated and are able to visit the Alphen Rec Center, you will be able to see the flag on display. Last year, our commencement speaker was U.S. Congressman Jared Golden, who spoke to our graduates about his experience that likely parallels yours, how he only entered college after completing military service. His speech was remarkable to me anyway, in that he seemed to deeply understand the experience of returned veterans who enter higher education to find their next steps. And I don't know, Brian, but you might want to make his speech accessible, folks. I think it might be on YouTube or on the KV website. But I thought he was really inspirational and helpful. And I really felt when he was speaking that he spoke from the heart about how he can relate to all the veterans who are in higher education. And that to me was really special. His experience and your experience helps relate to other people as well, and that's important. But I do think the veterans' experience is unique, and his perspective was very appreciated. The flag that flies over the KVCC Alphen campus today was donated by the Fairfield American Legion, and the commander of that post, Post 14, is KVCC graduate Joseph Frechette. Other notable alumni with whom we've worked include Mike Malone, who is currently a student at UMA, University of Maine at Augusta, and wrote the initial grant that became a catalyst for many of our veterans initiatives. Seth Johnson, a KV grad and a former Vista volunteer, worked on our veterans initiatives as well. Ralph Hendricks, a graduate of KVCC's mental health program and current veteran representative for the Career Center. And it's important to note that Mike Michaud, the former U.S. Congressman, who was Congressman for 12 years, was a ranking member of the House Veterans Affairs Committee, and he subsequently was appointed Assistant Secretary for Labor of Veterans Employment and Training in 2015, and that is also known as VETS, V-E-T-S, the acronym for Veterans Employment and Training Services, which is a division of the U.S. Department of Labor. VETS serves as the focal point for federal government for veterans employment by preparing military service members for transition to civilian employment, providing veterans with services to assist them in getting good jobs, protecting veterans' employment rights, and promoting veterans' employment in private sector. You might not know this, but Congressman Michaud is now a trustee on both the University of Maine System Board and the Maine Community College System Board. So in essence, he's one of my bosses. And that's also, I think, an important point to note. So we take veterans very seriously. We have passion for veterans affairs. We are grateful to all of you for the services you've provided to this country. We're also grateful, I believe, Roberta, you're going to be helping us moving forward with certifying veterans benefits, and I believe that's going to be coming up quite soon. Thank you for joining us, Roberta, and I'm really grateful for you volunteering to help with that work. That'll become very important. Each of you entered the military for a different reason. Some of you, it was your lifelong ambition. For some of you, it was an alternative that presented itself. For some of you, it was excitement. And for some of you, it was a path to success and a way to secure a better future for yourself and your family. Whatever your reasons, your service is selfless, and it's quite important. When I was younger, I was born in 1963, military service was required, and everyone had to register and get a draft number, and then the Vietnam War came, and then ultimately, mandatory conscription was abolished and it became a voluntary service, so everyone has to register for the selective service. But I don't know anyone who's been called up from the selective service just yet, but it is something that we're all required to do. So this transition from a mandatory service to one that is voluntary is really was an important shift in the United States, but also an important shift in the spirit of what it means to be a veteran. It means you volunteered for this job and you volunteered to take this on. And we do owe you a debt of gratitude, and we are grateful to have the veterans benefits to offer to you when they're available. And that's very, very important. My hope is that we also have a special major. I don't think a lot of people realize we have a major called TTO, Trades and Technical Occupations, and very few people take advantage of it. And this is meant for veterans who come to KV, want to get credit for prior learning from their service, and then translate that into a path toward a degree, and then design that degree with an advisor. We see very few people take advantage of that, which is understandable. A lot of folks want to focus on something very specific, whether it's electrical technology or medical assisting or nursing or liberal studies. That's understandable, but it might be helpful if you tell your friends who are also veterans coming to KVCC that they have another option that is actually a major specifically designed to get credit for the work that you have done or that they have done under military service, and that's very important. So I will turn this back over to Brian and the rest of you. Thank you all for participating in this. Thank you all for your service. I hope you have a great time and learn a lot from each other, and I look forward to seeing you on campus, hopefully sometime this summer after we get vaccination rates up. This has been a tough year for everybody. This has been a tough few weeks for everybody, and I'm really grateful to have you here, and I look forward to seeing you in person in the summer or in the fall. Thank you, and have a great day.
Thank you, President Hopper, and thank you so much for your support of this summit from day one. Our next words of welcome come from University of Southern Maine President, Dr. Glenn Cummings.
Good morning. I'm Glenn Cummings. I'm the president of the University of Southern Maine. Welcome to the Student Veteran Success Summit for Professionals. To the veterans and active duty members here today, thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice for our country. I'd like to recognize today Lori Spalding, USM's Director of Veteran Services, Camden Edge, a graduate of USM and also former employee in our Veterans Center, from the Maine State Approving Agency, and Brian Holt of the Kennebec Valley Community College for making this event possible. I'm very sorry that I am unable to attend virtually with you today, but I'm wishing you the very, very best and happy to participate in this way. Additionally, I'd like to thank business and community leaders for taking the time to participate in this important event. The success of our veterans and service members in the classroom and in civilian life is as crucial as their success was in active duty. At USM, it has been our mission to show the same level of dedication to our veteran students as they have shown us in our country. To fully commit to that dedication means gaining a greater understanding of student veterans' needs and experiences, as well as amplifying our own voices to share and promote all the opportunities we have open to them. We work to remove the barriers and create a space for those to triumph and prevail. Through the tireless work of our dedicated veteran service staff, our Husky vets, and others in the USM community, we have continued to push towards ensuring our university is truly militarily friendly as an institution. One where students are not only accepted, but they are welcomed, where their background and training are not overlooked and ignored, that it is built upon, and their skills and experiences are celebrated. This event is a wonderful presentation of the work Lori Spalding and her staff at USM do day in and day out. The attention, care, and focus they put into each project and initiative is matched by their respect and appreciation that they show our Husky vets. At USM, we understand that veterans join us at different periods along their journey. Whether it may be just out of active duty or years out of service, that support is unwavering on our part is essential. It is because of this commitment, this duty to veteran success, we have established a number of resources to help them thrive. These range from deciphering veteran benefits to reviewing military transcripts of prior learning, from the small, such as the reserve parking for Purple Heart recipients, to the recently established ULOS Veterans Promise Completion Scholarship. That focuses on helping veterans overcome hurdles to earning their degree and brings together both financial and academic resources for veteran scholars. To help our staff and faculty become more familiar with military life and resources, USM has established a 2-hour-long training session, Green Zone Military Awareness Training. An immense debt of gratitude is owed to Camden Edge for his work when he was here on the Green Zone project. While he was at USM, he saw that vision and helped execute it. We have been afforded the opportunity to educate faculty and staff through presentations and discussions led by student veterans and service members. This has led to clear lines of communication, a well-resourced staff, and an invested organization in the success of our veterans. USM does not want to back away from the unique challenges veterans face returning to the classroom. We want to work together to identify problems, to acknowledge the challenges, and overcome them to move forward. That is the purpose of today's summit. It is my hope that this summer produces fruitful connections, productive collaborations, and thought-provoking conversations for our students and the community. Thank you all again for your time, your participation, and your commitment, unmatched to our country.
Thank you, President Cummings. Our final opening remarks come from United States Senator Angus King.
What a great name for a session like you're engaged in right now, the Veteran Student Success Summit. Perfect. That's exactly what we're all working toward, and I know that you are working toward that every day. So I want to begin with just thanks and congratulations for coming together to do this incredibly important work. We have veterans throughout our educational system in Maine, community colleges, university, private colleges. We've got one, as you know, who's now a fairly recent veteran, Jared Golden, who is now a member of our congressional delegation. So what you're doing is just so important. Opening those doors and keeping them open, helping the veterans transition out of the military or out of the workforce into education is just so important, and to help them to stay on that track. It's not easy often. And, you know, we have things like housing allowances and things that we're trying to work out down here, telemedicine for the VA, better VA services. But the main thing I want to communicate today is how important what you're doing is, and that I want to be a part of it. So rather than tell you about what we've done, I'd rather look forward and say, let's see what we can do together to make your job easier and to make those veterans more successful. Be in touch with Teague Marcus from my office. Be in touch with my office in Washington. That's what we're here for. And if there are hang-ups either in the VA regulations or Department of Defense transition or whatever that we can help with, let me know, because it's one of the most important parts of my job is working to make the transition and the success of our veterans in Maine even greater. And you're a key part of that. So I'll go back to the beginning. Thanks for what you're doing. You're making a great contribution to your community, to the veterans, to Maine, and to the country.
Thank you, Senator King. It's now my privilege to hand the mic over to my colleague on the planning team, Camden Edge, who will introduce our keynote speaker. Take it away, Cam.
Thanks, Brian. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Jared Lyon, the president and CEO of Student Veterans of America. Jared and I go way back, and whether that's been participating in the SVA's national conference or their Leadership Institute, or even slinging hay barrels somewhere down in Texas, we've had a good run. And in this business, I have yet to find someone that can bring such passion and energy to the topic of student veteran success in education as Jared does day in and day out. So without further ado, the mic is yours, Jared.
Hey, Camden, thanks so much. And more importantly, thanks to all of you for making the time to ensure that this summit happens, even though we're living through a global pandemic. I apologize for my background. I'm coming to you live from my master bedroom here in Old Town Alexandria, Virginia. I'm not in my office in downtown DC because, you know, if anyone's been paying attention to the news, this is a unique time in our history. And I think more than ever, a really great time to make strong investments in who I believe will be the leaders to go on to solve the multitude of complex problems that our country is facing right now. Of course, I'm talking about student veterans, and I'd be remiss if I didn't sort of mention, Camden, I didn't tell you I would do this, but I want to take the opportunity. You've mentioned we've known each other a long time. We have. I've known you since you yourself were a student veteran. Now you're doing a job that is so very important to the great state of Maine. And I think that you are absolutely representative of what exists in the student population, specifically those who are military connected, military affiliated, military family members, and student veterans. And it's a multitude of things that I thought I might have the opportunity to speak with you this morning. But just to share by way of a quick background on myself, Maine holds a very special place in my heart. I didn't grow up in Maine. I grew up in New England, though, on the South Shore of Massachusetts in a very small town right next to Plymouth called Carver, Massachusetts. So that is the cranberry capital of the world, in my opinion. So if you've ever had cranberries or enjoyed them, you're welcome. I've had the great fortune to serve in the world's finest Navy. I enlisted in a peacetime military on August 5th of 2001. I left for basic training from Orlando, Florida, and headed out to Great Lakes, Illinois. I say I joined a peacetime military because while I was in boot camp, the world changed, not just for my generation of service members, but definitely for the country at large. And nothing would ever be quite the same. Maine holds an added closeness to me because I was stationed there for just under a year at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Kittery, Maine. If anyone tells you that's New Hampshire, they're not paying attention. That's Kittery, Maine right there. Absolutely gorgeous place to serve. And I brought a nuclear fast attack submarine up there, literally ripped it apart and then put it back together in Kittery, Maine. And then I brought her back out to sea. All that notwithstanding, I want to have the opportunity to kind of speak with you in hopes to deliver some value. I am somebody that's happy to answer questions. If you guys want to interrupt me along the way, that's not a problem. I'll keep the chat function up if you want to just hit them there, and I'll try to make some time to answer those questions as we go. But in an effort to try to deliver some value to you, I wanted to share some insights that we've gleaned at Student Veterans of America, specifically at our headquarters. Over the better part of the last 13 years, we've had the great opportunity to study the first 1.854 million veterans to utilize GI Bill benefits from September 11th, 2001 to present day. And so what we've learned from being able to do that is something that we try to share as openly and as freely as we can. I think that you all as professionals in this community would agree with me when I make the statement that there's almost just too much research on the success of student veterans. There's just too much resources that you can find. Of course, I'm being facetious, right? There's really not. And so as we can contribute knowledge to the space, as we continue to have summits like this across the state of Maine and really across the United States, it's important. It was right before the pandemic, the second week in March, that I was actually at a summit much like this across the state of Washington. And as we started to watch the pandemic move across the United States, if we can remember back to March of 2020, it was even sort of a risk to be able to travel all the way to Washington. But in a given year, I'll be on the road nearly 200 nights a year, having the great opportunity to get together with folks like you who are passionate about serving our population. And I think it's vitally important. So kudos to all of you for having that opportunity and the gumption to make sure that this event goes on, but keeps everybody's safety at the forefront. As we kind of take a look at the data, I want to start with some historical context, and likely some of this might be well known by folks, but I think it sets the stage very well for where we find ourselves today. So the notion of veterans in higher education utilizing some level of federal benefit dates back to the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. So this year will mark 77 years in which we had that benefit. But really, ever since the end of World War II, we've always had this feeling, I will call it a fear, that when veterans come to higher education, they're going to come with a multitude of issues, faced with a multitude of challenges, and they are not going to perform well once they arrive in education. And we've really held this belief for some time. What I might have to report to you could be controversial outside of a room of professionals such as yourself, but really we continue to make the same mistake. And what I think we have as an opportunity as professionals is an opportunity to stop the same mistake of history from repeating itself, which is that veterans aren't going to do well in higher education. There's no national aggregated data that demonstrates that, but it continues to be a fear. And unfortunately, as research demonstrates, even veterans believe that veterans will not do well in higher education. So let's go back to 1944. Prior to the Servicemen's Readjustment Act passing, there were multiple attempts in Congress to not let the provision of education be added to the GI Bill. Back then, this notion that we would pay with federal taxpayer resources for folks to go to college was a radical idea. I got to give Congress some top cover. Back in 1944, does anyone have any notion as to the percentage of adult-aged Americans that had a bachelor's degree or higher? Back in 1944, it was 7%. So 7% of society had a bachelor's or higher back in 1944. And unless you came from a white family and you were a male, there was little to no chance that you would have the opportunity for a post-secondary education back in 1944. Further, the average level of education for the service women and men who served in Europe and the Pacific during World War II, before their service, their average level of education was 8th grade. So this idea that we would invest in something of a population, education wasn't thought of in the same way back in 1944. But there were some visionary folks that really lobbied hard to try to ensure that Servicemen's Readjustment Act, which we now associate the GI Bill so readily with education, it wasn't the case in the original. The GI Bill provided for home loans and farm subsidies, and kind of the biggest provision that it made available was what we would refer to today as unemployment compensation. But back then it was called the 20 and 24. It was $20 a week for the first 24 months of separation. The big presumption was that unemployment would be just run rampant across the World War II generation. What's funny is when you had the 40 years to evaluate a piece of legislation, and longitudinally, that's kind of how you have to do it. You have to wait 40 years to be able to look at it in whole. What we were able to find is less than 6% of the World War II generation ever took advantage of the unemployment compensation. And yet, when you take a look at legislation, this is my own anecdote here, but you always want to follow the dollars. The dollars are where lawmakers place their assumptions as to the biggest need. And so that original GI Bill had a huge amount of provisions for unemployment compensation, and yet it was not really utilized at high degree. There was very little amount of provisions put in place for post-secondary education, and yet it became one of the biggest things utilized in that original piece of legislation. But there was great individuals, former national commander of the American Legion and a World War I veteran himself, Harry W. Comary, who fought really hard to make sure that education was added to that original GI Bill. And we've been better as a society as a result. Now, there were massive inequities with that original GI Bill, but you have to remember where America was at that time. There were inequities across legislation in 1944. And so every Congress has worked hard, and the 117th that we've just entered is no different. We'll continue working hard to make sure that those equities are not only recognized, but truly sought, so that we can have equitable legislation for all veterans, regardless of their background. But when we start looking at it, 1944, we also had some other resistance. It wasn't just Congress. We had college presidents nationwide who were quite literally posing massive resistance to this idea that a bunch of war veterans were going to return back to their pristine environments of higher education. And there was some sort of famous resistance from the college president of the University of Chicago in Illinois, himself a World War I veteran, who penned in an op-ed that he feared if we allowed World War II veterans to come to college paid for by the American taxpayer, they would only come for the ability to take a reprieve. They wouldn't be serious students. They would struggle academically, and they would create educational hobo jungles, is the language he used, colorful language from 1944. And then the president at Harvard also created massive resistance about the notion that even if we admitted this population, they wouldn't succeed. But what we learned after World War II is that those same two college presidents, just a small example, really kind of published retractions. The president at Harvard mentioned in his 1949 address, which included the largest portion of World War II veterans to graduate, that the World War II student veterans were by any measure, the most successful students in the history of Harvard. The New York Times and Times Magazine published in that same period of time that by any measure, there were no major academic infractions for any student veteran at Columbia University in New York. And the president at the University of Chicago later said about the World War II generation of student veterans that as a veteran himself, he got it wrong, and that the major issue with the World War II generation of student veterans is that they were hogging the dean's list, is how he quoted it. And so how do we fast forward in 2021 and still have this idea that veterans will not succeed? Well, interestingly, if you follow from World War II, move on to Korea and beyond, let's look at who had the ability to have notions of the percentage of student veterans that went to school. So in World War II, nearly 50% of the World War II generation leveraged education as part of their post-military success journey. Korea was 53. Vietnam was almost 58. The only dip that we ever saw was actually the Gulf War I generation. Less than 33% of that generation pursued education. But also take a look at what the economy was doing at that time. Take a look at how recruiting was working, that join the military, gain a skill was much more an emphasis of the Gulf War I era, which was mostly peacetime, even though they did serve in combat as well. Their war was just much shorter. Now fast forward to our generation. The post 9/11 generation of veterans, quite literally at this point, in aggregate, 73% of us have already achieved education, making us the most not only educated generation of veterans, but quite literally the most educated subsect of the US population. So if anyone ever sort of looks at you and says, I'm nervous that veterans are coming to higher education, I often ask why. There's no aggregated data that demonstrates that veterans will not ultimately achieve success. Now I will cover towards a little bit of the end of my talk, the top 5 areas that we've been able to uncover through our research that do present some unique challenges to the population and really catalyze the work that we can do to be able to make sure that we're empowering student veterans toward the success that we ultimately know that they're achievable of. But as we start looking at it, when we start monitoring the population at large, there is still this notion that, well, gee golly, thanks for your service, but let's be honest, if you were smart enough to get into college during an all-volunteer force, how'd you ever wind up in the military? Well, let's just sort of unpack that notion for just a quick minute. So in present day, 7 out of 10 military-aged Americans, the Department of Defense will define that as age 17 to 35, 7 out of 10 of that portion of the US population are ineligible to join the United States military. Ineligible. People in the post 9/11 era do not wind up in the military. They choose the military. And what is most unique about this generation that has been serving the longest period of sustained combat in our nation's history, those veterans of the post 9/11 era, they choose to serve their country during a time of war, noting that they may put themselves in harm's way. You can attribute them more to the servant's heart than individuals that had no other options and sort of wound up in the military. But even as veterans, we often do this to ourselves. Well, I wasn't all that good in high school, so I went into the military. Or, you know what, I tried college for a couple of semesters. It didn't work out well, and so I wound up in the military. And gee golly, I can't even imagine that I'm here at a college in Maine, whether that be a technical school, a 4-year university, a community college, grad school. We breed that in the military. We breed this notion of sort of downplaying myself for the benefits of the whole. And so that carries over, and that humbleness is good as a characteristic, but it doesn't do well to sort of give the sort of braggadocious nature in which I will talk about student veterans on their behalf, because very rarely will they do it on their own. But as we start looking at it from that vantage point, why are only 7 out of 10 military-aged Americans not eligible to join the US military? Number one reason, they didn't graduate high school. Number two, they struggle to pass the ASVAB. Think about this for a moment. The only government-administered national K-12 test that does not allow accommodations is the ASVAB. And the most common accommodation asked for on the ASVAB is a calculator, and you can't use a calculator on the ASVAB. Any other nationally administered test in K-12, a myriad of different accommodations. The third area is going to be what we couch as health concerns. Many people will mostly think that that's weight, and we do have a weight challenge in America, but it's also mental and behavioral health related concerns. You can't enter the military with mental and behavioral health related concerns. And just take a look at the college campuses for the traditional aged populations that we serve in Maine and across the United States. Nearing 50% of the student population has a mental or behavioral health related concern. And if you look at all veterans living, we're rated about 11%. So we actually have lower instances of behavioral and mental health as a whole, as a population. But then when you start looking at it, you go, okay, well, this is a great group of Americans that wind up in the military. What happens to them when they leave? Well, what we know is that the military actually has a positive effect on the ability for post-secondary education attainment. So when we look at it, the number one motivator cited by recruits in the post-9/11 era over the last 20 years, their number one motivation for joining the US military, the opportunity for an education. Number two, the ability to serve my country. Number three, opportunity and adventure. And so when you look at the vast majority of the population, you start looking at it, 53% in aggregate of the population cite that their number one is the opportunity for an education. Now, what we see when they exit the military, what we see is we as a nation make approximately 200,000 veterans each and every year as a country. When we start looking at that population, the portion of it that is in a college classroom within 7 months of separating from active duty is 115,000. A lot of people will say, okay, well, that's about 58%, but it's the positive tick, right? 53% upon entry, 58% upon exit. And a lot of folks will say, well, I'm concerned about, the remaining percentage of the pie. Well, if we think about it as a whole pie and 58% rate to college, what's happening with the rest of the pie? When we start looking at it, the percentage of folks that exit the United States military with a bachelor's degree or higher is near 21%. And if we can consider that only approximately 13 to 14% of the force is commissioned officers who would have had their degree before their commission, you're seeing a portion of the enlisted population is exiting the military with a bachelor's or higher in education. That's either because they had it before they enlisted or they completed it while they were on active duty. The next category becomes you have to remove those individuals who have reached their military retirement, either through medical or they've done their 20 years and either already have education or are deciding that they're not re-entering the workforce and will not pursue education. And then addedly, you have to remove from the portion of the population the totally and permanently disabled who will not be pursuing education. And what you're left with, separating from the active duty force each and every year, that is either not already pursuing education or does not intend to or is not eligible to, you're only left with about 11% of the separating force that won't pursue an education or doesn't already have it. And so this is something that is really vital to understand because we think that there is this idea that not many of us will pursue education when that's just simply not true. Well, then the next logical question is, what are we pursuing? Now, I can't speak to Maine specifically, and the data that I'm sharing with you is at the aggregated national level, but we can find some synergies there. What we know is that you can utilize VA educational benefits for such a wide range of things, not just post-secondary education, broadly categorized as certificate or vocational training. Well, since 2009, less than 5% of the post-9/11 era of veterans have ever used their GI Bill for vocational or certificate-based training. 95% of them are using it for post-secondary education. The majority, the vast majority, are using it for post-secondary education. The next thing to note on that is, my oh my, if we could conduct outreach to the 11% of the population not using their GI Bill who is eligible for it, they would be where we would see growth in vocational and certificate-based training. And right now, they are sort of this underserved population in a transitioning force. Just sort of mentioning that as an area for growth. The next thing that we have to understand about the population, if they're mostly going to post-secondary education, is how they pursue it. So the majority of the force is just like myself, first-generation college student. So first of your family to go to college, that's nearly 2/3 of the population. And the majority of that population on transition, that 115,000 that are going to go straight to college, the majority of them will start at a community college or a technical college. But here's where it gets tricky. the majority of those student veterans that start their educational journey at a community college or a technical college are very difficult to identify because the majority of them are not turning on their VA education benefit that early in their transition. We could think that this might be a problem. I would argue that it's really just the population getting smarter over time. They realize that community colleges and technical colleges are far more apt to provide academic credit for their military experience if they've had any sort of less than favorable things in their previous academic background. Community college and technical college is a great place to sort of go to clean that up. And it's an opportunity that we really need to sort of understand the population. 52% of the transitioning force is married with children, and 20% of the force is single parents. And so community college meets you where you are. And if we more sort of start to understand how student veterans make their decisions about post-secondary education, we start to realize that we are not all that dissimilar from how Americans make their decisions. The vast majority of Americans will not attend a college or university that is more than 100 miles from where they graduated high school. Veterans are no different. And what we start observing about the transitioning force is that nearly 80% of the transitioning force does one of two things when they separate from active duty, if they are non-retirees. They go home to where they are from or their significant other is from. And so if somebody leaves from Maine to go into the US military, they're gonna come back to Maine more likely than not. And they may be bringing a family back with them when they do. And when they get back home, they choose the school that is nearest to them. And very frequently, they are coming out of the military at awkward times, and admissions for community college and technical school are far more flexible with regard to admissions. That's how I started my educational journey at Brevard Community College when I separated from active duty in 2005, before going on to Florida State to finish an undergrad and then Syracuse University for graduate school. And so student veterans are not all that dissimilar. They start at community college, but they're hard to track because they're not all using their benefits. And on average, aggregated national data demonstrates that they are only there for 2 semesters. And then they matriculate into a 4-year. And what we know is that 63% of student veterans that are using the GI Bill for a 4-year degree started their education journey at a 2-year, not all of whom complete their degree at a 2-year. Again, they're matriculating, they're becoming transfer students to those 2-year schools. And so some of them aren't as concerned about whether or not they complete the credential of an associate's degree if their ultimate goal is a bachelor's degree. What we also know is that 42% of those student veterans that finish a 4-year degree go on to graduate with a master's degree. Here's just a fun statistic. There are more prior enlisted veterans in the United States with a master's level of education than there are officers who are veterans with a master's level of education. Kind of just fun with numbers. There are just way more enlisted folks than there are officers. But the notion is that the national aggregated data demonstrates that we're going to start at community college, we're going to matriculate into a 4-year, and nearly 42% of that population is going to do just like what Camden did, stick around and get a master's and then enter the workforce and be kind of an all-around badass like Camden is. This is the norm, is what we're seeing nationwide. And so when we start looking at that, we start to ask the questions of, okay, well, so I was a diver in the Navy, I love the term underwater basket weavers. I've looked for them. I haven't really found many, but not many people are majoring in underwater basket weaving. So what are they majoring in? Well, they're majoring on the top 3 majors in this order: business, science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM, and then health-related fields. And not only are those arguably among the most academically rigorous degrees, but we're also figuring out is that they're the most job-ready degrees, that when I graduate at a 4-year, I have a job available to me. And one thing that we're finding is no cross-correlation from your MOS or the job you did in the military. As in the Navy, we didn't have MOSs, but like ratings or whatever you might have called it in the Air Force, Camden, I just don't know. I'm teasing. But when you start looking at it, we find an aggregate that nearly 80% of the population in the post-9/11 era do something post-military that has absolutely nothing to do with what they did in the military. You're more likely to find somebody who was a medic to major in accounting. You're more likely to find somebody who was, a mechanic, not majoring in engineering, but in business. And somebody in the combat arms is more likely to major in the health-related fields than they are, security or law enforcement. And so what we're starting to understand about the population is motivations and enlistment are for an education and the opportunity to serve my country during a time of war. And so different than a peacetime generation of veterans, the all-volunteer force of the post-9/11 era chose to serve their country in a time of war. They made their decision on their job in the military, less on what I wanted to do after the military, and more based on when is the shift date to basic training. This winds up being the bigger decision maker as to what we do in the military versus near about anything else. So it should be no surprise that 5 to 6 years later after military service, they major in something and then pursue a career that might have little to nothing to do with what they did in the military. I'm not downplaying MOS translators by any means, other than they're not super inclusive because not every branch calls it an MOS, but that they're not particularly useful in predicting the longitudinal outcomes of the population because most pursue something different. We've got to remember that higher education is an opportunity to recreate oneself. When student veterans are coming to higher education, we're not necessarily doing so like a high school student might be to find ourselves, but we're trying to create that future for ourselves and our family, and we're leveraging higher education to do it at great success. Last 2 points about how the population is doing, and then I'd love to just jump into the top 5 observational areas that we have for opportunity to support the population. We're going to talk about real quickly just how the cross sections of the population are. So student veterans nationwide are actually on average, more of us are Black as a population than the overall student population and the US population. I'm going to give you numbers to this. The nationwide population of Black Americans is on average about 13.4%. Higher education is actually 15% Black students. Student veterans, 17%. So we overrepresent in that regard. We are slightly more likely as a student veteran population compared to traditional students to be Hispanic or Latino or Latina. And then nearly 2/3, as I've already mentioned, are first generation college students such as myself. And what is also needed to be understood is that the population itself is increasingly female. So if you look at the overall nationwide average of veterans, about 11% of that population is women and growing. Active duty force is nearing 18% and growing almost every year. It's the quickest growing demographic in the US military. But as student veterans, we overrepresent as women. 27% of all student veterans nationwide right now are women veterans. And something that we're particularly proud of at Student Veterans of America is that near 50% of our chapter leaders are actually our sisters in arms, women veterans. And so the last notion is on graduation rates. Graduation rates are tricky. I say that only because of the definition by the Department of Education on graduation rates. First-time, full-time student graduates within 6 years. It's not really a fair characteristic for adult learners or post-traditional students as the term comes into vogue. But as we start taking a look at it, what is a better measure of success is the success rate. And so when we look at that, it asks a more straightforward question. Did this individual start school and did they ultimately complete school? And so when we look at the nationwide graduation rate of student veterans, because I do want to compare it, you're looking at about 54% graduation rate, but compared to traditional students at about 52.7%, student veterans are slightly higher. But when we now measure success rate, traditional students jump up from that, I'll call it 53%, up to about 63%, and student veterans are nearing 74%. The only cohort in higher education that has a higher success rate than student veterans is actually international students, and it's ever so slightly higher than student veterans. And so any way you slice the data, this is an incredibly successful population. Now, I do want to make a note that I would never make the point that our population isn't without its challenges. All that to say, I'd like to cover what we've identified as through data and research, the 5 key areas that are most common to be challenges for the population that we see huge opportunity for professionals to have a focus on. Number 1 is actually access to childcare. Childcare is a really understood need for veterans in post-secondary education, and an effort to solve it can make a big difference. Now, I want to make clear that I'm not referring to what is traditionally understood as 9 to 5 childcare while mom and dad might be working. What we're referencing is the before my regular childcare and the after. I might be in a group project and the project leader is 21 years old and sets the group meeting at 9:30 at night. And my kids are already in bed and I don't have the ability to rush back to the meeting if it's in person or figure out the Zoom situation now that we're all living through this virtual situation. So it's looking for those childcare options that are not, I drop them off in the morning and I pick them up at night, but in those off hours, nights, weekends, more during midterms and finals, and sort of understanding that population a lot better. Number two is financing education. This is hard for folks to wrap their heads around sometimes because they say, well, isn't the GI Bill like the greatest federal education benefit? Short answer is yes, it sure is. But on average, student veterans are graduating with nearly $20,000 in student loans. Compared to the civilian population at nearly $40,000 in student loans. Why are we about half and still taking out student loans? Well, it's something we're working on. But if you sort of look at GI Bill reform, there hasn't been radical reform in the GI Bill for 77 plus years. And so what we're starting to look at is how, from a legislative and a policy perspective, can we better understand how student veterans have to use the GI Bill? I've already mentioned the educational journey map, but think about it. In your first semester utilizing the GI Bill, on average as the end user, not talking about the VA, not talking about school certifying officials, but often in your first semester, the first time you use the GI Bill, it is usually nearly 2.5 months delayed from actually hitting your bank account through a variety of different reasons. But when you're that first time, full-time student with a family, you are looking for those opportunities to make sure you can make ends meet, and you were planning in your budget that the GI Bill would hit. Well, you're going to have to take out a loan. Moreover, as we start looking at it, we essentially make student veterans declare their major in their first semester because that's how the GI Bill works. On average, student veterans are changing their major of study 2.3 times compared to civilians at 1.7 times. We often start in majors like history, criminal justice, and the social sciences. I'm a social science guy. I'm not dogging those majors, but we often graduate in business, STEM, and health-related fields after we sort of do college on the job, mostly because if I want credit for my military service, it goes to gen eds, and that removes the opportunity in a liberal arts education for academic exploration. And so when we remove that from student veterans, and nearly 2/3 of the population is first-gen college students, they are learning college as they go, which leads us to our third thing. It's advising. When we start thinking about advising, this is often thought of as while we're students. What we've identified is that it's before we're students. We have to stop making the presumption that just because a student veteran has now enrolled in our school and in a field of study, that is in an informative way what they want to do post-graduation. And so if we think about how Americans choose college beyond geographics I've already mentioned, it is high school guidance counselors, and the number one is families. Well, if we mostly come from first-generation families, we're really doing college on the job. And so we've got to sort of figure out when they're new students before they arrive, is there a way that we can provide that intervention to ensure that they're winding up in the right major of study early, such that their GI Bill is not exhausted on academic exploration, but is going to the major of study that they actually want to pursue. Number 4 is employment. This has been probably one of the most stark problems during COVID-19. We know that over 50% of the student veteran population is working full-time while they're in college, and another 20% is working part-time while they're in college. The GI Bill is generous, but if you've got a family or you're a single parent, it does not cover all your expenses. And so at the undergraduate level, student veterans nationwide on average are taking 15 credit hours when they're enrolled in school and working full or part-time. The 2 industries that they're most commonly to be employed in while they are students, retail and service. These are not the industries that they're ultimately going to work in. And when COVID-19 hit, has caused massive unemployment rates for student veterans. And we still have a problem that in 2013, we changed the law because we were fearful that veterans were double dipping by getting their GI Bill and being eligible for unemployment. So to bring the unemployment numbers down by the Department of Defense, we said if your last employer was the Department of Defense within 18 months of separating from active duty, you're not eligible for the GI Bill. So if we think, for unemployment. So if you think about which Americans are not eligible for unemployment, that list is very small. During the pandemic, we actually had to work with the Secretary of Labor to not enforce that so that the $700 kicker was actually eligible for student veterans that were making the hard decision, do I have to drop out of college so that I'm eligible for the unemployment? No, don't do that, right? And we'll always work on those problems to try to make sure they're identified. But here's the other challenge. When a student veteran graduates on average from their bachelor's degree at 5.5 years, they're entering a workforce that is dissimilar from what they did in the military based on their degree And for 5.5 years while they were likely working, they worked in an industry that had little or nothing to do with the industry that they now graduated in. So the average age at graduation for a student veteran at a 4-year degree is 33 years old, with a work history that doesn't make sense to employers. And so a big opportunity that we have is to try to work with our career services departments across our campuses to not just be focused on jobs at graduation, but also jobs while students, and make sure that we can align those jobs with the degrees that they're actually pursuing to ensure that there's better alignment from a work history and the benefit of networking. And then the fifth and final is straightforward. It's the connection to a community. What we understand about this population is the number one thing that a veteran does not identify as within their first 5 years from separating from active duty. Believe it or not, it's a veteran. And so this makes it really difficult in the language that we choose. And so how do we reach out to a population that doesn't identify this way? Now, to be clear, it's not because we're not proud of our service, but there are a variety of reasons in which we've exited the service. And the majority of us, when we do, we are not retirees. We do not have a pension. We do not have access to the same kind of healthcare, and we have families. In the hierarchy of needs, I'll be a veteran later when I have more time. Interesting fun fact for us. The average age somebody joins a national veteran organization, 54 years old. Interestingly, are veterans that dissimilar from Americans at the same age group? I argue no. If we call a veteran organization anything more than a civic organization, let's compare the average age that somebody in America joins a civic organization. Kiwanis Club, the Lions Club, something of that nature. The average age is 53 years old, right? And if we look at how many veteran organizations in the United States, we have 42,000 of them. Approximately 4.2 million veterans are associated with the National Veteran Organization. There are nearly 19 million veterans alive in the United States. Most veterans don't identify as a veteran, right? What we've also understood is that veteran is not so much an identity as it is a lived experience. And when we start understanding the identity of the population, we have this opportunity to bring them in. And so rather than being focused on strategies of veteran friendliness, which doesn't really have as much meaning in post-secondary education, we encourage strategies of veteran inclusiveness, looking across campus, across departments, and understanding where, based on the 5 needs that I've just covered, are there already synergies that necessarily don't cause budget constraints to be able to implement. Camden, I think you told me to wrap at noon, and I'm happy to take questions if folks have them, but that's really all I had for just some thoughts that I wanted to be able to share based on data, based on some of the research and experience that we've had over these past 13 years. And I hope perhaps some insights on the top 5 biggest challenge areas as reported by veterans in our data while they're in post-secondary education, such that we can make that a focus of opportunity for growth of our programs towards overall student veteran success. But I'm happy to take any questions that anyone has, and truly thank you so much for carving out some time for me.
Thanks for this, Jared. This was great, and I think it's a perfect way to really kickstart the rest of the week as we talk about some of the more specific sessions around how we can better support student veterans in higher education. I think you really set the tone and provided some great data that folks can use moving forward. We will jump over to the next session, so unfortunately there isn't a ton of time for questions. With that, I will shamelessly plug an event that's not mine, but Jared looks like he's the keynote for the National Association of College and Employers on a conversation on the student veteran experience in a time of COVID. And I know a lot of folks are curious as to how to best engage student veterans in this time where things are happening remotely. So in the chat bar, I will drop the link to register for that if you're interested. That's on January 22nd, and it's free registration. So another chance to capture the life-changing words of inspiration from Jared Lyon.
It's too much, brother. But also, if I could shamelessly plug, our national conference, NatCon for short, is virtual this year, February 19th through the 20th. We've waived registration due to generous support from donors, so student veterans don't pay a dime for the experience. I can drop a link into the chat box for that registration, but Higher ed professionals, as well as student veterans and alumni, are more than welcome to attend. We're going to have 40+ breakout sessions, 5 general sessions talking on social inequities, life living virtually, and a myriad of other things that are super important to the life cycle of student veterans. So we welcome you all to attend. If you haven't registered yet, I'd definitely highly encourage it. I'll drop a link in the chat. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Jared. I've definitely attended a few times. It's worth attending. So I'm just dropping 2 more things in here for folks. Here's a quick link for a survey. And second up, and probably of most interest to folks, is here's the next Zoom link. As soon as folks jump over to our next session, we're having a panel of student veterans to talk about their experiences in higher education. So again, thanks everyone for joining. Thank you, Jared. Thank you, President Hopper. And folks, enjoy the rest of the week.